The sun blazes down on the marble tiers of the Colosseum. 80,000 Romans roar as a battered retiarius circles his armored foe. In the imperial box, Emperor Titus watches intently, not merely for sport, but for power. On this day in 80 CE, the games are more than entertainment. They are Rome's most potent weapon of control. Why would an empire that ruled from the moors of Britannia to the sands of Arabia pour such staggering resources into bloodsport? The answer lies in the strategic heart of Roman statecraft. Gladiator games were born in the shadow of war. Their earliest forms were solemn rituals, executions of prisoners of war at the graves of generals. But by the time of the Flavian emperors, they had evolved into an instrument capable of shaping the mood of the world's largest city. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena sent a message. Rome is strong. Rome is merciful when it chooses. And Rome's leaders stand above the common man as arbiters of life and death. The stakes in 80 CE were immense. Only a decade earlier, the empire had been torn apart by civil war. The new Flavian dynasty needed more than legions to secure its throne. It needed the loyalty of the mob. And in a city where a single riot could topple emperors, the mob was a force more dangerous than any foreign army. The Colosseum itself was a monument to military victory, built with the spoils of Jerusalem after the Judean revolt. Its very stones whispered of conquest. But it was also a promise, bread for the hungry, spectacle for the restless, and a display of imperial generosity that no senator could rival. Yet beneath the spectacle ran a dangerous current. The crowd's cheers could lift an emperor to godlike status or condemn him to ruin. The games, like any weapon, could turn on their master. Consider this: if you were Titus, ruling a city of 1,000,000 restless souls, knowing your dynasty's survival might hinge on their approval, how far would you go to win their devotion? And at what cost to your empire's strength? Because in Rome, the arena was never just about the fight, it was about the fight to rule. If the Colosseum was Rome's stage, its gladiators were the actors, but they performed with the discipline of soldiers. And that was no accident. The brutal elegance of gladiatorial combat was not some chaotic brawl, it was the product of a military machine that had conquered the known world. The origins were soaked in war. In the early Republic, captured enemies were executed in ritualized duels to honor the dead. Over time, these ritual killings evolved into the gladiatorial schools ludi that trained men not merely to fight, but to embody Rome's martial ideals for the watching crowd. Step inside a ludus and you'd find a microcosm of a Roman legion. The barracks were ordered and regimented. Fighters slept in rows of identical cells. The day began at dawn, with weapons drill, shield maneuvers, and conditioning so punishing that many recruits, especially slaves and criminals, died before ever seeing the arena. Those who survived were hardened into living weapons. The training methods mirrored those of the legions. Wooden swords, rudis, heavier than steel, forced recruits to build endurance and strength. Drills on open ground simulated battlefield formations, especially for gladiator types that mimicked legionaries, like the Mamillo, armed with the same broad scutum shield and stabbing gladius as Rome's infantry. Even exotic styles like the retiarius, fighting with net and trident, were taught with precision, their movements choreographed to create dramatic contrasts, just as Roman generals might pit different troop types to exploit enemy weaknesses. These schools were run with the efficiency of a military command. The lanista, often a retired centurion, was both drill master and strategist, deciding which fighters faced each other and tailoring their training to exploit strengths or cover weaknesses. He understood, as any battlefield commander would, that matchups could be engineered for maximum spectacle and maximum control of the crowd's mood. But why did this matter to the empire? Because the games were propaganda. Every blow struck in the arena reinforced the narrative of Roman dominance. Gladiators, whether volunteers or slaves, fought under the same values preached to the legions: discipline, courage, and obedience to command. For the citizen in the stands, the arena was a reminder that Rome's military ethos was eternal, embodied in men who fought to the death for the glory of the crowd and, by extension, the state. The logistics themselves were an extension of Rome's military prowess. Just as the legions could march 20 miles in a day and build a fortified camp by nightfall, the games could summon hundreds of fighters, wild beasts from Africa and Asia, and exotic equipment from every corner of the empire, all arriving on time, in place, like an army assembling for war. The same road networks that carried the legions also brought elephants from Numidia and tigers from Parthia to thrill Roman audiences. This was not mere entertainment, it was a demonstration of logistical supremacy. The connection between army and arena was also personal. Many gladiators were veterans fallen on hard times, seeking coin or glory in the sand. Others were prisoners of war, Parthians, Dacians, Gauls now forced to fight in the Roman style, their defeats in miniature echoing the defeats of their nation. The message to the provinces was unmistakable: resist Rome, and not only will you lose, you will fight and die for Rome's amusement. Consider one such man, Lucius Varro, a decorated centurion discharged after a leg wound crippled his marching ability. Unable to work the fields, he sold his services to a lanista. His discipline and skill turned him into a star of the arena, adored by the mob, feared by opponents. But to Varro, each bout was another campaign, a chance to command respect, even if his unit now consisted of killers and thieves. His story was not unique. Rome blurred the line between soldier and gladiator, between war and spectacle. The deeper genius of the system was that it kept the martial spirit alive among civilians. Long after a war ended, the arena reminded Romans of their military heritage. The cheers for a skilled sword thrust were the same cheers that once greeted victory reports from the frontiers. And so, without marching a single legion, an emperor could keep the idea of conquest burning in the public mind. But there was a cost. The more the games imitated the army, the more the people began to see spectacle as a substitute for war itself, a subtle shift that would, in time, erode Rome's martial edge. The Colosseum was not a battlefield, but it was run with the precision of one, and in that precision lay both Rome's strength and the seeds of its eventual complacency. In the summer of 80 CE, Rome awoke to a spectacle unlike anything it had ever seen. For 100 consecutive days, the city would be fed not only with bread, but with the blood and cries of the most elaborate games in history. This was the opening of the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, and Emperor Titus intended it to do more than dazzle. It would secure his family's dynasty, silence his critics, and bind the people of Rome to his rule. The stakes were enormous. Only a decade earlier, Rome had been in chaos. The year of the four emperors had left the empire fractured, and the Flavians had risen to power through the bloody victory of Vespasian in the Judean War. The Colosseum itself had been built on the site of Nero's private lake, a symbolic reclamation of public space from imperial excess. Funded by the spoils of Jerusalem, its very foundation was a statement. The empire's wealth came from conquest, and its rulers would share that wealth with the people in the form of entertainment. The opening ceremonies were carefully choreographed. Titus, still in his 30s, understood that public perception could be as decisive as any military campaign. The first day began with a venatio, a beast hunt in which exotic animals from across the empire were released into the arena: lions from Mauritania, leopards from Cappadocia, crocodiles from the Nile. Skilled hunters armed with spears and nets dispatched them in displays of agility and courage. Each animal was an unspoken map of Rome's reach, a reminder that no corner of the known world lay beyond the emperor's grasp. But this was only the opening volley. Naval battles Nomachiae were staged by flooding the arena with water, pitting ships and crews in mock sea combat. The engineering required was staggering, a display of logistical mastery rivaling that of any Roman campaign. The message was unmistakable. The same empire that could conquer Judea could also command rivers and seas at will. Then came the gladiatorial contests, the true heart of the games. The matchups were chosen with a strategist's eye for drama. A heavily armored Secutor against a nimble Retiarius, a Thracian against a Mamilio, each pairing designed to hold the crowd's attention and provoke roaring debate over who should live or die. Titus himself presided over the judgments, raising or lowering his hand to signal mercy or death. His clemency in some matches was no less calculated than his ruthlessness in others. The political dimensions were layered. Senators who had opposed the Flavians were given prominent seats, forced to watch the people's adoration of the emperor. Provincial envoys were invited to witness Rome's grandeur firsthand, ensuring they returned home awed and loyal. Even the distribution of free food during the games was strategic, reinforcing the panem et circenses policy that kept the city's massive population fed and docile. Tactically, the event was a masterpiece of timing. Titus launched the games in a year when Rome needed distraction. Only months before, Vesuvius had erupted, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum, and a devastating fire had swept the city. The games shifted the narrative from disaster to triumph, rallying the population behind a ruler who appeared generous, strong, and unshakable. Yet, as in war, the most dangerous threats often come from overconfidence. The scale of the spectacle set a precedent that future emperors would feel compelled to match or exceed regardless of cost. Titus's own brother and successor, Domitian, would escalate the brutality and extravagance, using the arena to project fear as well as favor. For the fighters themselves, the opening games were a trial by fire. Some were seasoned veterans, others newly trained men thrust into combat before the eyes of the emperor. Their personal stakes were immediate. Victory meant survival and perhaps fame. Defeat meant death or disgrace. Behind every clash was a human drama, a Gaul forced to fight the style of the legionary who once conquered his homeland, a freedman seeking glory to erase the shame of his birth. The engineering marvel of the Colosseum itself became part of the narrative. Its 80 entrances allowed for rapid crowd movement, its subterranean hypogeum concealed elevators and trapdoors to release beasts or fighters in sudden bursts of drama. Every technical innovation was another reminder of Rome's superiority in organization and design skills as vital to empire as battlefield strategy. But the most powerful weapon in Titus's arsenal was the crowd's emotion. Each gasp at a near miss, each cheer at a well-placed thrust, each collective roar at a kill reinforced his position. In those moments, the will of the people and the authority of the emperor were one. As the 100th day drew to a close, Titus had achieved his objective. The Flavian name was secure, the people of Rome were united in awe, and the provinces had been reminded of the empire's might. Yet the seeds of dependency had been sown. The populace, having tasted such spectacle, would expect it again and again, drawing future emperors into a cycle where political stability depended not on policy or victory abroad, but on the blood spilled in the sand. Consider the risk. A general knows that once troops grow accustomed to lavish supplies, discipline falters if they are withheld. The same was true here. Rome's loyalty had been bought with games, but such loyalty was costly to maintain. And in the decades to come, that cost would grow heavier than any emperor could bear. The Colosseum's opening was more than a celebration. It was a calculated, strategic maneuver, a projection of strength wrapped in the thrill of combat. But, like many such maneuvers, it contained the flaw that would one day undo it, a reliance on spectacle that could never match the sustaining power of real military discipline and conquest. In Rome, the Colosseum was more than a monument to blood and stone, it was a political battlefield. Here, emperors could cement their rule, senators could rise or fall in public favor, and ambitious men could gamble their futures on the cheers of the mob. The arena was the Senate floor, stripped of marble and pretense. Its debates fought not with words but with swords. From the earliest days of the empire, the games were a currency of power. The emperors understood that to control Rome, they must control the crowd. Lavish spectacles were an unspoken contract. The ruler provided excitement, and the people returned loyalty at least for a while. But just as in war, alliances were fragile, and momentum could shift with a single misstep. Senators used the games to buy influence, funding spectacles at their own expense to win elections or curry imperial favor. A well-executed festival could raise a man's standing overnight. A poorly staged one could end a career. Even seating arrangements carried political weight. The emperor's box was flanked by senators, equestrians, and visiting dignitaries, each placed with calculated precision to show rank, reward loyalty, or remind rivals of their place. The games were also an arena for subtle and sometimes lethal political messaging. When an emperor granted mercy to a defeated gladiator, it could signal benevolence or, more strategically, suggest that the emperor's enemies might also be spared if they submitted. Conversely, a thumbs down could be a warning, a public demonstration of what awaited those who defied imperial will. Some rulers blurred the line between sponsor and spectacle. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, stepped into the arena himself, dressed as a gladiator, fighting opponents armed with blunted weapons while he wielded sharp steel. To his supporters, it was proof of his courage and connection to the people. To his enemies, it was a grotesque parody of leadership, eroding the dignity of the imperial office. In the end, Commodus's theatrics alienated the Senate and emboldened conspirators, leading to his assassination. Tactically, the manipulation of the crowd was a high-stakes game. A skilled ruler could redirect public anger away from famine or military defeat by staging more frequent games. But this reliance was dangerous. As with an overextended army, constant expenditure drained the treasury, and the populace grew dependent on spectacle for satisfaction. Crowds themselves became a political force. They could demand mercy for a favored gladiator, boo an unpopular official, or even chant for policy changes. In 559 CE, a riot during games in Pompeii between local spectators and visitors from Nuceria escalated into street fighting, forcing the Senate to ban games in the city for a decade. The message was clear: the mob's passions, once inflamed, could not be easily contained. Rivals learned to exploit this volatility. A senator hoping to embarrass an emperor might bribe gladiators to perform poorly, turning the crowd's disappointment into public criticism of imperial stinginess or incompetence. Likewise, a clever lanista could use a popular fighter's fame to pressure sponsors into political concessions. Even foreign policy found its way into the arena. Victory over an enemy could be celebrated with staged battles featuring prisoners forced to fight in their native armor, reenacting their defeat for all Rome to see. Such displays reinforced the empire's dominance but also broadcast its priorities to allies and adversaries alike. In every sense, the arena was an extension of the empire's strategic map. Control the Colosseum, and you controlled the heartbeat of the capital. Lose it, and you risked losing Rome itself. For the emperor, the challenge was balance. Too much cruelty, and the crowd's awe curdled into fear. Too much mercy, and strength appeared to waver. Every match was a decision point, every cheer or boo a report from the front lines of public opinion. Consider the question: if you ruled the greatest city in the world, knowing that 80,000 voices could turn against you in an instant, would you gamble your fate on a spectacle of blood? In Rome, every ruler did, and some lost everything. For the citizens of Rome, the gladiator games were not a sideshow, they were part of the city's lifeblood. To understand their true power, you have to see them not as isolated events, but as a constant undercurrent in Roman culture, shaping behavior, beliefs, and even the empire's sense of itself. The arena was a mirror of Roman society. Its seating told you exactly where you stood in the social hierarchy. Senators occupied the prime spots nearest the action, a visual assertion that political power sat closest to the pulse of Rome's spectacle. Behind them, equestrians and prominent citizens filled the next tiers, followed by the common plebeians. At the very top, high in the blazing sun or exposed to the rain, sat women, foreigners, and slaves. The arena reminded every spectator of their place in the imperial order. The games also produced a strange paradox in Roman attitudes toward gladiators. These men, often criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war, were despised for their low status, yet adored for their skill and bravery. Some became celebrities, their likenesses painted on tavern walls, their names scratched into the stone of the Colosseum by fans. Wealthy women were rumored to seek affairs with famous fighters, defying social norms in pursuit of forbidden glamour. For the ordinary citizen, the games were an escape from the grind of daily life. In a city of 1 million people, most lived in cramped insulae, multi-story tenements prone to fire and collapse. Public baths offered relaxation. The games offered exhilaration. A day in the arena meant free bread, the thrill of combat, and a shared experience that blurred the lines between class and origin at least for a few hours. Economically, the games were a vast industry. Animal traders captured beasts from the far edges of the empire, from Numidian lions to Syrian leopards. Craftsmen forged ornate weapons and armor for both practical combat and theatrical display. Tavern owners and street vendors made fortunes selling food and drink to the tens of thousands streaming in and out of the amphitheater. Even funeral workers benefited. The aftermath of a bloody day meant work to be done. Culturally, the games served as a constant reminder of Rome's martial heritage. Children played at being gladiators in the streets, mimicking their favorite fighters. Poets and playwrights wove arena imagery into their works. Provincial cities copied the capital, building their own amphitheaters to hold local games. In doing so, they absorbed Roman customs, language, and political loyalty, a form of cultural conquest without the sword. From the state's perspective, this was strategic genius. The panem et circenses, bread and circuses, policy didn't just pacify the masses, it reinforced Roman identity across the empire. By standardizing the spectacle, Rome created a cultural common ground. Whether you lived in the shadow of the Colosseum or in the far reaches of Gaul, you could understand the rules, the rituals, and the values on display in the arena. But the cultural impact had a darker side. The normalization of extreme violence blurred moral boundaries. Public executions and savage animal hunts desensitized the population to brutality, making it easier for the state to employ violence as a tool of policy. To the Roman mind, mercy was a luxury, strength was survival. Archaeological evidence gives us vivid glimpses of this reality. Graffiti praising favorite fighters, mosaics depicting famous bouts, even gladiator helmets offered as grave goods. These artifacts tell us that the games were more than entertainment, they were woven into personal identity. A man might measure his courage by the gladiator he admired most. A politician might judge his popularity by how loudly the crowd cheered his name. Ultimately, the games shaped how Romans saw themselves. They were heirs to a martial tradition, citizens of a city that celebrated strength, endurance, and the will to dominate. And as long as the sand ran red, they believed that the empire's strength was unshakable. But culture cuts both ways. The same spectacles that unified the empire also taught the people to expect spectacle as a right, a dangerous precedent for a state that would one day struggle to meet those expectations. Every empire has a moment when its greatest strength begins to turn against it. For Rome, the gladiator games, once a testament to military discipline, imperial power, and cultural unity, began to shift from strategic asset to dangerous liability. The transition was gradual, but unmistakable to those who understood the mechanics of power. By the late 3rd century CE, the costs of staging grand spectacles were soaring. Exotic beasts had to be captured in increasingly distant and hostile territories. Gladiator schools demanded constant investment in training, housing, and feeding fighters. The amphitheaters themselves required maintenance on a scale rivaling military fortifications. For emperors facing multiple crises, the choice between repairing a frontier wall or importing elephants for the games became a political gamble, and too often, spectacle won. The reason was simple: the mob's favor had become a critical element of survival. In the Republic, legions had secured political legitimacy. In the late Empire, it was the roar of the crowd in the arena. An emperor could survive a battlefield defeat if the populace still adored him. He could be undone by their boos and jeers if they turned. This dependence created vulnerability. Like an army accustomed to lavish supplies, the Roman people became conditioned to expect constant, extravagant entertainment. Anything less was seen as weakness, an opening for rivals to exploit. Ambitious generals and senators learned to host their own games, subtly undermining imperial authority by showing they could deliver more excitement than the emperor himself. Meanwhile, the empire's external threats were multiplying. Germanic tribes pressed the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The Sassanid Empire challenged Roman power in the east. But as military crises deepened, emperors were often in the capital, staging spectacles to shore up urban loyalty instead of leading campaigns in person. The games had become a political shield, one that left the frontiers dangerously exposed. Moral authority also began to erode. The growing Christian movement condemned the arena's bloodshed as barbaric and unworthy of a civilized state. Their refusal to attend games and their vocal criticism planted seeds of doubt among the populace. The state's reliance on lethal spectacle to maintain unity began to look less like strength and more like desperation. Personal accounts from the time capture this shift. One Roman officer, writing from the northern frontier, bitterly complained that "Our emperor feeds lions while the barbarians cross the river unopposed." His words reflected a widening gap between the military's priorities and those of the urban political elite. The games also began losing their original martial character. Earlier spectacles had reinforced the values of discipline, courage, and skill. By the later empire, the emphasis had shifted to sheer spectacle, more animals, more executions, more elaborate stagecraft. The crowd no longer cheered for precision and endurance, it demanded novelty and excess. What had once been a training ground for public admiration of martial skill was becoming a theater of decadence. The tipping point came when the games themselves became more important than the victories they were meant to celebrate. In earlier centuries, an emperor's generosity in the arena was tied to a recent conquest. Spoils and prisoners from the battlefield paraded before the crowd. In the later empire, games were staged without military victories to justify them, draining resources without replenishing Rome's prestige abroad. It was a fatal shift in strategic thinking. The empire was spending its strength inward, on a domestic audience, rather than projecting it outward against its rivals. Bread and circuses were no longer tools to reinforce military dominance, they had become substitutes for it. If you were emperor and your throne rested on the loyalty of a volatile mob, would you risk cancelling the games to fund the legions? Or would you gamble that the frontiers could hold a little longer while you secured your grip on the capital? Rome's rulers too often chose the latter. By the early 5th century, when Emperor Honorius finally outlawed gladiatorial combat in 404 CE, the games were no longer the glue holding the empire together. They were a memory and a reminder of the years when Rome mistook spectacle for strength. When the Gladiator Games finally ended in 404 CE, Rome did not fall the next day. But the echoes of their absence and of their long dominance shaped the empire's final century and left an imprint that still lingers in our world. The most immediate consequence was cultural. For centuries, the games had been a shared experience that transcended class. The Colosseum was the one place where senators, merchants, and beggars all looked toward the same sand. With their disappearance, one of the empire's most powerful tools for creating a common civic identity vanished. The social glue that had once bound the capital's volatile masses together dissolved, leaving a population less easily united behind a single symbol of Roman strength. Politically, the loss of the games removed a key instrument of crowd management. The panem et circenses policy had been crude but effective. The promise of bread and spectacle had bought emperors time in moments of crisis. Without the games, rulers had to find new ways to secure loyalty, often resorting to increased grain subsidies or public works. These were costly and less emotionally potent than the thrill of the arena. From a military perspective, the absence of the games removed a subtle but important channel for reinforcing martial values. For centuries, the arena had celebrated skill with arms, endurance under pressure, and courage in the face of death. In later years, that message had been diluted, but it still echoed faintly with each bout. Once gone, Rome lost a cultural stage where military ideals could be rehearsed and admired in civilian life. In the provinces, the decline of gladiatorial spectacles weakened one of Rome's most effective tools of cultural assimilation. Amphitheaters from North Africa to Gaul had served as outposts of Roman identity, projecting the capital's customs deep into conquered territories. Their silence marked a symbolic retreat of Roman influence, even in places still under imperial control. Long-term, the end of the games also shifted the moral compass of the empire. The Christian condemnation of blood sport helped redefine Roman concepts of civic virtue. Public life turned toward processions, sermons, and theological debates, events that unified the faithful but lacked the visceral, unifying force of a day at the Colosseum. For the military elite, this was a mixed blessing. It reduced the normalization of cruelty, but it also meant the martial spirit was less present in the daily life of citizens. The historical impact reached far beyond antiquity. Medieval tournaments, with their jousts and melees, were in many ways sanitized heirs to the Roman arena martial spectacle harnessed for political prestige. In the modern world, sports stadiums echo the architectural and social function of amphitheaters, while mass events still serve as tools for leaders to project unity and strength. The lesson is clear: public spectacle, whether violent or peaceful, remains one of the most potent instruments of political and cultural influence. But the decline of the games offers a cautionary tale. Rome's experience shows the danger of letting spectacle become a substitute for actual strength. For centuries, the empire's leaders believed they could buy stability with bread and blood. It worked until the treasury was strained, the frontiers were vulnerable, and the moral legitimacy of the spectacles collapsed. By the time the games ended, Rome's military position was already weakened, and no amount of pageantry could reverse it. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding of these consequences. Inscriptions in provincial amphitheaters show how deeply the games were tied to local identity. Remnants of gladiator armor in Britain and Gaul suggest that even distant outposts embraced the spectacle as their own. The abrupt end of these traditions would have left a cultural vacuum, one that no policy could easily fill. For contemporary strategists, the message is unmistakable. Spectacle can reinforce real power, but it cannot replace it. When the crowd's roar becomes the measure of a ruler's success, the state's foundations are already shifting. The arena is silent now, but its lessons speak loudly. Win the people's hearts, but never forget that the survival of a nation depends on the strength of its walls and the discipline of its soldiers, not the applause of the crowd.